They dressed her in white wool and sent her up the mountain to die. A peace offering. A soft little bride for a monster. That was the story the valley told itself as the carriage rolled away through the gates and the fine lords wept their fine tears. And nobody, not one of them, looked too closely at the girl inside, which was their first mistake, because under all that white wool, wrapped tight against the cold of her, was a harness of throwing knives. Silver cord, balanced to the grain, and the girl staring out the frosted window with her hands folded so sweetly in her lap wasn't a virgin sacrifice at all. She was the thing you sent to kill the monsters. Her name was Wren. 19 years old, though she'd stopped counting birthdays somewhere around the time she learned that nobody was going to celebrate them. And for 3 days, she'd sat in this freezing box on wheels listening to the axles groan and the frozen mud crunch going up and up into a country that got whiter and quieter and lonelier with every mile. Across from her, 2 guards from her father's garrison huddled under bear pelts and tried not to look at her. They pitied her. She could see that. The younger one especially, he kept sneaking glances, then jerking his eyes back to the floor. The way you look at a lamb, you know, is going to the block. And underneath the pity, something else. Relief. Because it wasn't them. Because she was the one being fed to the beast, and that meant they got to go home. Should reach the gates before dark, the older one muttered. My lady. He couldn't quite meet her eyes when he said it. Wren nodded. Once. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken in 3 days. Not since her father, Duke Merrick, had summoned her to his study, poured her a cup of watered wine like she was a servant he was being generous with, and told her in the same flat voice he used to order the culling of a sick horse that he'd sold her to the mountains. Sold. That was the word he used. Not given. Not promised. Sold. For 3 generations, the valley had lived under the shadow of the mountain pack. The raids came in winter fast and merciless, and stripped the border villages down to bone. Cattle gone, grain gone, sometimes people gone. And now a new alpha had taken the high crags, a man the mountain folk called a king, and he'd sent down his terms. A tithe of grain, a tithe of iron, and a bride of noble blood to seal the treaty in the old way, blood-binding blood. Duke Merrick had 3 true-born daughters. All 3 of them were safely married to lords in warm valleys far from here. And then there was Wren, the bastard, the scullery maid's daughter, the shadow he kept locked away in a hunting lodge at the edge of the Black Wood, because from the time she was a child, she'd had a talent, an unnatural, unsettling talent for tracking the things that crept out of the dark. Vampires in the old crypts, ghouls in the pauper's graveyard, feral shifters in the deep pine. She wasn't a princess. She was an exterminator, and when the Mountain King demanded a noble daughter, her father had looked around at his warm, safely married girls, and then remembered the one he'd hidden in the woods. The one nobody would miss. Wren let her hand drift to her waist, felt the cold press of steel through the linen. 4 throwing knives, silver at the core. 2 skinning daggers strapped high on her thighs. A wire garrote sewn into the hem of her cloak, thin as a hair, and strong enough to take a man's head off if you knew the angle. And she did. She always knew the angle. She hadn't come up this mountain to be a bride, because her father had given her one last command, whispered in that study, with the door shut and the fire dying. Get close. Wait for the beast to shift into its wolf skin when it's slow and heavy and stupid with the change. Then open its throat. Do that, he'd said, and there'll be a horse waiting at the tree line to carry you home. The carriage lurched to a stop. Both guards flinched like they'd been slapped. Outside, the wind screamed through the pass, and it carried a smell into the cabin that made the hair on Wren's arms rise. Wet fur, pine pitch, wood smoke, and under it all, faint and animal, the smell of something that walked on two legs, but wasn't quite a man. Out. A voice on the other side of the door. Thick accent. Low. The younger guard fumbled the latch with shaking hands, dropped his gloves in the mud, didn't even bend to pick them up. The door swung open, and Wren got her first look at the Iron Crag. It wasn't a palace. She'd half expected a palace, some grim mountain castle, out of a bard song. This was nothing like that. This was a fortress built by people who expected to be attacked and expected to survive it. Black stone walls cracked and remortared 100 times, watchtowers worn down by centuries of ice, a courtyard of packed dirt and horse dung and dirty snow, and people, a dozen of them, maybe more, standing in the cold and watching the carriage. No polished armor, no livery, boiled leather and heavy furs and rings of iron. Their eyes were too bright, amber-pale green, a yellow that no human eye ever was, and too still, and all of them fixed on her. Then they parted. They parted the way water parts, without a word, and a man came down the stone steps of the keep. So this was him. Wren studied him the way a butcher studies a carcass. Cold, precise. Looking for the joints, the soft places, the way the weight sat. I was tall, but he didn't loom the way she'd been told he'd loom. He carried himself with a kind of heavy tiredness, like a man who'd been awake too long and had forgotten what rest felt like. His hair was dark and shot through with early gray iron, threading black, and it fell around a face that looked carved from stone and left out in the rain through too many hard winters. Older than she'd pictured. She'd imagined someone young and hungry. This was a man who'd already spent most of what he had. He wore no crown, just a wolf pelt across his shoulders and a wool tunic worn thin at the elbows. And climbing the left sides of his neck, disappearing behind his ear, was a scar. Not a knife scar, not a claw scar. A silver burn. Old ropey, terrible. Wren filed it away without meaning to. He's been careless before. Someone got close to him once with silver, and it nearly took his head. "The grain's in the wagons behind us," the older guard called out, stepping in front of Wren, his voice cracking on the wind. "And the Duke sends his blood as agreed." The man stopped 10 paces off. His eyes, a startling storm cloud gray, moved from the shaking guard to Wren. And here was the thing she hadn't braced for. He didn't look at her like a predator looks at meat. He looked at her like a tired man looking at one more problem he'd have to solve before he could finally sleep. "Leave the wagons," he said. "Leave the girl. Go back down the mountain before the storm breaks." His voice was low, rough, not cruel, just done. The guards didn't wait to be told twice. They practically threw Wren out of the carriage, shoved her forward into the mud, scrambled back inside, and the driver had the horses turning, before the door was even shut, wheels spinning in the slush, and then they were gone, fleeing back down, toward the warm, safe valley that had never once been warm or safe for her. And Wren was alone. Standing in the freezing mud, in a white wool dress that was frankly an insult in this weather-dark hair whipping across her face. She didn't shiver. That was a thing she'd trained out of herself years ago in the lodge in the winters. The body wants to shake, and the shaking will get you killed. So you take the cold, and you fold it up small, and you put it somewhere you can't feel it." She met the Wolf King's eyes and kept her breathing slow and even, and in the back of her mind, the arithmetic ran on its own. 1 second to draw, half a second to throw. His throat's exposed the second he turns. The king exhaled, a long plume of white. He dragged a rough hand down over his jaw. "You're freezing," he said. Flat, like it annoyed him. "Get inside before you lose your toes." And then he turned his back on her, just turned, and walked toward the keep, which was tactically insane. The back of his neck was right there, bare above the collar. 20 feet of open ground and one throw, and it would be over before he hit the stones. Except there were 20 wolves in this courtyard, and every single one of them was watching her. And if she killed the alpha here in the open, she'd be in pieces before his body finished falling. Timing. Everything was timing. Wren pulled her ruined cloak tighter, and she followed the monster into his den. The great hall smelled of roasting mutton and wet earth and wood smoke. It was huge and drafty, and warmed by one enormous stone hearth in the center, where a fire roared and threw orange light up the black walls. No tapestries, no musicians, no gilt, no glass, no soft anything. Just long scarred tables full of people eating fast and quiet, the way people eat when they've known hunger and don't trust that the food will still be there tomorrow. They put her at the high table, next to him. The wedding feast was a wooden trencher of meat set between them and a single iron cup of black bitter ale. There were no vows. Nobody read from a book. An old man with milky blind eyes shuffled up, dipped his thumb in a bowl of ash, and marked their foreheads. A cold smudge, a mutter in a tongue. Wren didn't know, and then he shuffled away again. And that was it. That was the whole of it. She was the Wolf King's wife. She kept waiting for it to feel like something. It didn't. He ate in silence, tore the meat with strong fingers, and didn't offer her the good cuts, didn't try to charm her, didn't try anything at all. Every few minutes, someone came up to the table. A woman with a dispute over winter rations, a man whose roof had caved under the snow. And each time, he set down his food and listened. Really listened. Head-tilted eyes on them. And then he'd give a short, plain order, and the person would go away, looking lighter than they'd come. Wren watched him do this 6 times, and she thought this isn't how a warlord behaves. This is how a tired mayor behaves. She barely touched her food. She was cataloging. The exits. The guards. Which of the wolves was fastest, which was drunk, which favored a bad knee. And him, mostly him. He was guarding his left shoulder just slightly. An old wound, the kind that aches worse in the cold. His reflexes were sharp. He caught a falling tankard without looking. But there was a stiffness in him. A body that had been broken and healed crooked more than once. Slowly, the hall emptied. The pack drifted off to wherever they slept. The king wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, stood, and nodded toward a narrow stone stair. "Come." Wren stood. Her heart kept its slow, even beat. She was a professional. She'd tracked rogue bears through blizzards. She'd cornered a nest of feral vampires in the ruins of the old empire and come out the other side with all her fingers. One tired wolf in one bedroom was just a matter of geometry and speed. He led her up the winding stair to a heavy oak door and pushed it open. The alpha's chamber was as bare as everything else. A great 4-poster bed, piled with furs. A small fire fighting a losing battle in the grate. A wash basin in the corner, the water in it already skinned over with ice. No luxury, no pretense. A room for sleeping in nothing more. He crossed to the fire and picked up an iron poker and stirred the dying coals. He didn't look at her. Ren stood by the door, and here it was. The moment. She let the heavy cloak slide off her shoulders and pool on the floor. Underneath the white shift buttoned to the collar, she reached up, slow, like a frightened bride, exactly like a frightened bride, and undid the top 2 buttons. And her right hand drifted down toward the hilt of the silver dagger strapped high on her thigh. Let him turn around. Let him see the girl trembling by the door. Let him take one step thinking he's owed something. And then the throat. The king set the poker down. He turned around. He looked at her, standing rigid fingers at her collar, a knife blade of tension in the firelight. And he sighed. It was the most human sound she'd heard in 3 days. A deep, bone-tired sigh. He walked to a cedar chest at the foot of the bed, lifted the lid, and pulled out a thick wool blanket and a spare pillow. And he threw them on the rug in front of the fire. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and started unlacing his boots. Ren's hand froze on her collar. "I don't snore," he said, not looking up, tugging off one muddy boot and dropping it with a thud. "But I sleep light. Don't wander the halls tonight. My people are on edge with a stranger in the keep, and some of them have worse tempers than I do." She stared at him. The whole script in her head, the beast, the advance, the helpless maiden, it just evaporated, left her standing there holding nothing. "You—" Her voice came out cracked and rusty from 3 days of silence. She swallowed and tried again. "You aren't demanding your rights." The second boot hit the floor. He looked at her, and this time he really looked for the first time since the courtyard, like she was a person, and not a package that had been delivered to his door. "I demanded grain," he said quietly, "so my people wouldn't starve this winter. Your father threw you in as a sweetener. Because he's a coward, and he thinks a piece of paper and a blood tie will stop me biting back if he decides to cheat me, come spring." He pulled his tunic over his head, and Ren saw his chest, his back in the firelight mapped with pale scars, dozens of them. But none of them were silver burns. They were claw marks. Deep raking, terrible claw marks. Beast fighting beast. Over and over. For years. "I don't want a wife," he said, lying down on the blanket on the hard stone floor, his back to her, dragging the wool up over his shoulders. "I want 3 solid meals for the children in the lower Bailey. That's all I ever wanted from your father." He pulled the blanket over his head. "The bed's yours. Lock the door if it helps you sleep. Good night, girl." And Ren stood in the center of the room for a long, long time. Her fingers still hovered over the hilt of the silver blade. Because the target was asleep. Or pretending. And his back was to her, and the great artery in his thigh was completely unguarded, and she could cross the room in 2 strides and be out the window before he finished bleeding. She took a step. The floorboard creaked under her boot. His breathing didn't change. Slow, even, deep. And Ren looked at the huge, soft bed piled with furs, and she looked at the man sleeping on the cold, hard stone. And she thought about the children in the hall, the thin ones, the quiet ones eating fast like the food might disappear. Eating the grain her father had hoarded in his cellars for years, while border villages starved. Slowly, she let her hand fall away from the knife. She didn't take off her dress. She didn't take off her boots. She climbed up onto the furs and sat with her back against the headboard, and her knees pulled up to her chest, and she watched the rise and fall of a monster's shoulders, until the sky went from black to bruised gray. Dawn in the mountains didn't break. It bled, a pale purple wounded light seeping through the frost on the windows. Wren hadn't slept. She sat exactly where she'd sat all night, listening to the fortress wake iron ringing on wood down in the yard. Voices in the cold, the smell of smoke thickening, and on the floor, the king finally stirred. He sat up, ran a hand through his messy hair, glanced at the bed. He didn't look surprised to find her still there, fully dressed, coiled like a set trap. "There's water in the basin," he said, pulling on his tunic. "It's probably frozen. Breakfast's in the hall. You can walk the grounds, but stay inside the inner palisade." And then he was gone. Wren let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since the valley. She cracked the ice in the basin and splashed the water on her face and let the cold of it snap her back into her body. She checked her knives. All there. She smoothed the wrinkles out of her ruined white dress and went down to see what kind of place her father had traded her into. By daylight, the iron crag was even harder than it had looked in the dark. Everything about it said survival. Women mending leather armor with bone needles. Men splitting cordwood breath, steaming. A boy carrying water with cracked red hands. There was a desperation to it, but a shared one. A people all pulling the same rope against the same winter. And she felt the eyes on her the whole time. A big man stepped into her path. Broad through the shoulders, a hard jaw, eyes the color of old brass, carrying a bundle of iron traps over one arm. He didn't smell like the king. He smelled sharper, angrier. "You're the valley girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "Torvald, second to the king." Wren looked at the traps. Bear traps modified thicker teeth, heavier springs. "Those won't hold the things in the deep woods," she said. He laughed. A short, ugly bark. And what would a silk-wrapped lord's daughter know about the deep woods? "I know that if you chain that to a dead tree, whatever you catch will snap it off and drag the steel back to your camp behind it." She met his brass eyes. "Anchor it to living root. Greenwood gives. It won't break." The smirk faltered. Then it hardened into something meaner. He stepped closer, using his size, letting his shadow fall over her. "Listen, little bird. The king took pity on you. Fine. But to the rest of us, you're leverage. A hostage in a pretty dress. So keep your mouth shut, sit by the fire, and stay out of the—" A scream tore across the courtyard. Not surprise, not anger. Pure animal terror. It came from the outer gate, and the whole courtyard came apart at once. Torvald dropped the traps, and his hands flew to the axes at his belt. Somewhere behind her, the keep doors banged open, the king taking the stone steps 3 at a time. And Wren didn't think, because thinking was slow, and the thing that lived in her muscles was fast. 13 years of it, the cold hours in the lodge. Osric drilling her until her arms gave out, and then drilling her some more, and that thing took her over, and she was already running boots, pounding the frozen mud right on Torvald's heels. They hit the inner gate together, and there in the archway was the nightmare. A wolf, but not one of the king's people. This was a straggler, a rogue. Enormous its fur, matted with old blood and filth one eye. Gone milk-white and blind, the other rolling in a mad frenzy. White foam hung from a jaw that could crush a horse's leg. Something rotten was in it. Some sickness of the deep woods that had burned its mind down to nothing but hunger and rage. And in the mud in front of it, scrambling backward too slow, was a boy. 10 years old, maybe. No more. "Hold the line," the king roared, ripping a broadsword from his back. But the rogue wasn't interested in armed men. It went for the boy. Torvald swung and missed too far left. The king was sprinting, and he was 3 seconds too far away, and Wren was already moving. Her fingers hooked the hidden sheath at her hem and tore it free, and the silver throwing knife was in her hand, and she planted her lead foot and turned her hips, the way Osric had taught her 10,000 times in the freezing dark, and she threw. The blade hissed through the air, and buried itself to the hilt in the rogue's one good eye. The beast shrieked an unearthly, wet-tearing sound, and its own momentum carried it over the boy and into the mud, thrashing blind, now all the way blind. And before it could find its feet, Wren was on it. She dropped to her knees in the muck, both skinning daggers out, ducked under a wild sweep of one massive paw, fisted her hand in the thick fur at the base of its skull, and drove both silver blades up under the jaw into the brain stem. The thing went rigid. Then it collapsed. Dead weight, done, and the courtyard went absolutely silent. The only sound was Wren's breathing harsh in the cold. She stood, her white dress, the ridiculous, insulting virgin bride dress, was soaked black with foul blood, and it dripped from her hands, and her face gave away nothing at all. She wiped the daggers clean on the dead wolf's pelt and slid them back into their sheaths. She set her boot on its snout and pulled her throwing knife free with a wet sound, and cleaned that too. Then she turned around. Every wolf in that courtyard was staring at her, frozen, horrified. Torvald stood with his axe still half-raised, jaw slack, and 10 feet away stood the king. His broadsword was lowered. His gray eyes were locked on her, and they weren't tired anymore. Not even a little. They were sharp and wide awake, and doing math of their own. He looked at the monstrous dead thing in the mud. He looked at the small, blood-soaked girl who had killed it in 5 seconds flat, and she watched the understanding land on his face like a slow, cold dawn. Duke Merrick hadn't sent a fragile bride to soften the wolves. He'd sent a butcher to slaughter their king. Wren met the king's stare across the ruined yard. She didn't flinch. She held one silver blade loose at her side and waited to see what the wolf would do, now that he knew exactly what had been let through his gate. The wind howled through the palisade, and nobody moved. And then the king did the last thing Wren expected. He didn't raise his sword. He didn't call his wolves down on her. He slid the broadsword back into the sheath on his spine, a long metal scrape that rang across the silent yard like a struck bell, and he said in a voice with no fear in it at all, "Torvald, burn the carcass, bury the ash deep, keep the dogs off it." Then he turned those gray eyes back to her. "You, inside." Wren wiped her hands on the one clean patch left on her skirt, and she walked. Past the wolves in their boiled leather, past the ones who'd sneered at her the day before, and not one of them tried to stop her. They stepped back. They gave her a wide, careful berth, eyes tracking the silver handles at her thighs, and she understood then that to them the metal didn't just look dangerous. It smelled like death, like graves and cold iron, and the one thing in the world that could kill them for good. She followed the king through the great hall and up a narrow stair she hadn't seen before into a cramped little room stacked with ledgers and maps pinned to the walls with iron nails. It smelled of beeswax and old ink. He shut the head door behind them, leaned against it, crossed his arms. 4 throwing knives, he said. 2 skinners, a garrote in your hem. He recited it without a pause, without a blink. All silver. Your father didn't send a bride girl. He sent an executioner. Yes, there was no point lying. He'd watched her move. So why, he said, am I still breathing? which was, she had to admit, a fair question. Ren looked at him. He wasn't angry. That was the strange part. He looked curious the way a man looks at a live coal that's fallen onto his desk, trying to understand the danger before it burns the whole place down. "My father told me you were a monster," she said. Level, flat. "He said you demanded a noble girl to tear apart for sport. He said killing you was the only way to save the valley. And monsters don't sleep on cold stone to give their prisoner the bed." The king went very still. "Monsters don't ration their own grain to feed peasant children they'll never meet." She held his eyes. "My father is a liar. He didn't send me here to save anyone. He sent me here to break the treaty, so he wouldn't have to pay your iron tithe come spring." The king let out a long breath. It might have been a laugh if there'd been any humor left in him. "Merrick's a cheap bastard," he said. "I'll give him that much." He crossed to the desk and poured water from a clay pitcher into 2 cups and held one out to her. Ren took it, sniffed it once, pure habit, and drank. "If you'd killed me," he said, "my pack would have torn you apart before you reached the outer gate." "Did he tell you that?" "No. He told me there'd be a horse waiting at the tree line." "There's no horse." "I know." Her fingers tightened on the cup. "I knew it the moment the carriage drove away. I was never coming home. I was a thing you use once and leave in the snow." And the silence that came down between them then wasn't the tight, coiled silence of the courtyard. It was heavier than that. It was 2 people who understood in their bones exactly how little the world had ever valued their lives. "What now?" she asked. "That rogue in the yard." He set his cup down. "It was infected. The rot. We haven't seen that sickness this far south in 30 years. He looked at her, and something shifted behind his eyes from suspicion to something almost like need. "My people hunt by scent, by instinct, but the rot masks the scent. It confuses the pack, blinds us." "So you need a tracker," Ren said. "Someone who hunts with their eyes and their head, not their nose. I need my people alive." He said it plain. "You're not a bride girl. I don't give a damn about marriage rights. But you're a hunter, and right now the Iron Crag needs a hunter more than it needs a queen." Ren set the cup down on the ledger-strewn desk, and she thought about the lodge, the chains, the dark. Her father's face appearing only when he had a target that needed to quietly disappear. Here, the stone was cold, and the people were beasts, but they were honest beasts. "I'll need proper leathers," she said. "This dress is finished, and I want the smithy. I have modifications to make." The corner of the king's mouth moved, almost a smile. "Done," said Rourke. "Welcome to the Pack Valley, girl." They gave her 2 days before they put her to work. 2 days in which the pack had absolutely no idea what to do with her. Because she was a walking contradiction, a fragile human who smelled of valley soap and silver death, who ate at their tables and slept in their king's bed, and had opened a rot-mad rogue like a fish in the time it took most of them to draw a weapon. On the 2nd morning, Ren stood at the edge of the armory in oiled leather that actually fit her running a whetstone down the edge of a skinner. And across the yard, Torvald and 3 others watched her work and didn't bother to hide it. Then Rourke came out of the keep, buckling a bracer to his forearm. "We lose daylight in 4 hours, he called. "Torvald, Fen, Bryn, you're with me. We track the rogue's path back up the ridge and find where it crossed our border." He looked at Ren. "And her." Torvald spat in the mud. "You're bringing the human." He didn't lower his voice. "She'll sink in the snow. And if she trips and cuts one of us with those silver toys. If she wanted you dead, Torvald, you'd be bleeding in the snow right now." Rourke's voice went flat and dangerous. "She tracks better than you do." Torvald's jaw worked. He wanted to argue. "But you didn't challenge the Alpha at the gate, not in front of the pack, and he knew it." He turned and marched for the tree line. The deep woods behind the Iron Crag were not built for people. Ancient pines, so tall and so thick, they strangled the sun and left the forest floor in a permanent freezing twilight. The snow here wasn't the churned slush of the yard. It was deep and powdery and treacherous, and the wolves moved through it like it was nothing. They didn't sink. They glided senses, reaching out into the dark. Wren trudged behind, working twice as hard, breaking through the crust with every step. But her eyes never stopped. An hour in Torvald stopped, knelt, pressed his face to the snow, and took a long, shuddering breath. Then stood brushing his knees. "Trail's dead," he grunted. "Wind shifted, wiped it clean. We're chasing ghosts." "No," Wren said. "We aren't." She walked past him, past the sneer, and she didn't look at the snow. She looked at the bark. 10 paces to the right, to a huge, twisted trunk, and there, 4 feet up, caught in a bead of hardened sap, a snag of coarse gray hair. "It didn't run straight," she said. "It was staggering. It clipped this tree." She dropped into a crouch and swept the fresh powder away with her glove. Underneath the older packed snow was fractured not a clean print, a drag. It hauled its left hind leg, here. She moved 3 paces on and swept again. Short stride. It was turning toward the ravine. Rourke came over, looked at the hair, looked at the broken crust, looked at Torvald. Torvald stared at the evidence mouth, a hard, flat line. He couldn't smell it, but he couldn't argue with it either. "Lead the way, Hunter," Rourke said softly. For 3 hours she read the woods like a scholar reads a rare book. Broken twigs, crushed lichen on a stone. A drop of frozen black blood buried under fresh snow that no nose could ever have found. She didn't use magic. She didn't use gifts. She used ruthless, exhausting, relentless attention. The only inheritance her father had ever meant to give her turned now to a purpose he'd never intended. And the wolves watched her. And slowly she felt it, the way you feel weather change the hostility in Fen. And Bryn cooled into something else, wary fascination. Because humans were supposed to be blind and deaf out here. Humans were supposed to be prey. And Wren was not prey. She was a predator, running on a frequency they'd never heard before. The light was failing when she raised a fist. "Hold." Every wolf froze. She pointed toward a narrow rocky cut ahead, where the snow was churned and trampled. And a second later, the wind shifted and brought the smell up to all of them at once. Not just rot blood now, but the stench of an opened slaughterhouse. Rourke drew his sword. Torvald readied his axes. They slipped forward through the rocks. And what lay in the clearing beyond stopped them cold. A herd of mountain elk, scattered across the bloodied snow, but not eaten. Torn apart, mutilated in a frenzy of pure violence, and left to rot in the cold. "Waste," Fen whispered, horrified. Because to the pack, killing for anything but survival was a sin against everything they were, not just waste. Wren knelt by the nearest carcass. She examined the bite radius on its neck, then dug a jagged, black-stained tooth out of the frozen muscle with her dagger and held it up. Massive. The rogue in the yard didn't do this. Look at the spread of the bite. Look at the spacing of the tracks around it. Rourke crouched beside her, his face close to hers, as he read the ground. "There wasn't one rogue," he said. low, grave. No. Wren wiped the tooth on her leathers. There's a whole pack of them, and they're moving downhill, toward the valley. You couldn't navigate the ravine in the dark, not without dying in it. So Rourke called a halt under the overhang of a great shale cliff out of the worst of the wind. No fire meant smoke, and smoke meant broadcasting your position to anything with a nose. Instead, they dug a Dakota hole, a small, fierce ember pit sunk into the dirt, invisible from 10 paces. The wolves sat close around it, chewing dried venison in tense silence. The news of an infected pack loose on their border had burned away the last of the hostility toward Wren. Now it was just cold, and survival, and the long, dark waiting. Torvald took first watch and vanished into the rocks. Fen and Bryn curled together under pelts and dropped into a light, twitching sleep, and Wren sat cross-legged by the edge of the pit gloves off cleaning her knives. Draw, wipe, inspect, sheathe, a ritual, the oldest one she had. Rourke sat across from her, watching her hands. "You don't sleep," he said. "I sleep when I'm safe. You're surrounded by the deadliest predators in these mountains. Something almost gentle in it. You're as safe as you'll ever be." Wren paused, looked up. The embers caught the exhaustion carved around his eyes, and the old silver scar climbing his neck. "The deadliest predators in these mountains," she said, "are currently being hunted by something worse." She slid the blade home. "Besides, I'm not used to company." He shifted, leaning back against the cold stone. "Merrick kept you hidden," he said. "Why?" And Wren didn't answer right away, because she wasn't used to being asked about herself. She was used to orders, coordinates, proof of a kill. Talking about herself felt like baring her throat to a stranger. Except this stranger wasn't looking for a soft place to strike. He just wanted to know the shape of the thing he was working beside. "I'm a bastard," she said finally. No self-pity in it. Just fact. "My mother was a scullery maid. She died when I was 6. Winter fever, they told me." A pause she didn't understand yet. Merrick didn't want me in the castle. Bad for his image. So he sent me out to the old hunting lodge at the edge of the Black Wood. She picked up the second dagger. Began again. "The lodgekeeper was an old man named Osric. Hunted for the crown once before he lost an eye. He didn't know how to raise a little girl, so he raised a hound instead. Taught me to read the mud, walk without breaking a twig, throw steel." "And when you got good?" Rourke asked. "When I got good, my father found a use for me. The valley has pests, vampires in the crypts, ghouls in the graveyards, feral shifters in the deep pine. You can't send an army after things that hide in the dark. Armies are loud and cost gold. You send one girl who doesn't officially exist." She shrugged. Tight, mechanical. "I was his secret, the ghost that kept his trade roads clean." Rourke was quiet a long moment. "He made you into a weapon," he said. "Weapons don't cry when they're left out in the cold." She nodded at his neck. "What about you kings sit on thrones? Not in the mud-chasing rothounds. Where'd the silver come from?" His fingers went to the scar, without his telling them to. "I wasn't born a king," he said. "My pack was small. Scavengers, mostly. We lived off what the big packs left behind. When I was 19, we starved. Worst winter in memory. 19. The same age she was now sitting here across from what that 19 had grown into. She turned the number over and didn't like the weight of it. "I broke the old treaty," he went on, staring into the coals. "Went down into the valley to steal sheep off a baron's estate. And the baron was waiting for me. He'd hired a man, a mercenary, someone who knew how to use silver. Wren stopped cleaning her blade. Because she knew what silver did to a wolf. She knew the agony of it was enough to break most shifters' minds forever. "I got greedy," Rourke said. "Went for the lamb. And the mercenary caught me with a silver chain whip. Wrapped it right around my throat." His voice stayed flat, which was somehow worse than if it had shaken. "I tore my own throat open, pulling free of it. Bled out in the snow. He thought I was dead and left me to rot. My brother found me, dragged me back to the caves and poured boiling pine sap into the wound to stop the bleeding. Boiling sap, on a raw silver burn. It was a miracle he could still speak. I lived," Rourke said. "My brother didn't. A hunter's arrow 2 weeks later. And that was when I understood that living like rats meant dying like rats. So I fought the alphas of the local packs, and I won. I bound them together. I made them build the Iron Crag, so we'd never have to steal sheep to survive again." He looked at her across the dying embers. "You're a weapon your father forged to guard his gold," he said. "I'm a shield I forged to guard my people. We're both just tools, trying not to break." And Wren looked into the Wolf King's eyes. And for the first time in her whole life, she didn't see a target. She didn't see an employer. She saw someone carrying the same bone-deep tiredness she carried. The same weight of a life spent being useful to everyone and precious to no one. She reached out, handed him a strip of dried venison. I took it, and their fingers brushed his skin fever-hot the way a wolf's always runs hers cold and calloused from leather and steel. And the moment hung there. Small, fragile, real. Wait. Some detail from his story had snagged in the back of her mind, like the gray hair in the sap, and she couldn't get it loose. A baron, a hired mercenary, a silver chain whip. Her father had always kept men like that. Men who did quiet, ugly work for coin. Men who didn't officially exist. The same kind of man he'd later made of her. She almost said it. Almost. Except the wind shifted. And it carried a sound up out of the dark ravine. Not a howl. A low grinding chitter, like wet bone, dragged over stone, and it echoed up the shale walls, and multiplied until it sounded like 100 starving things were already among them. The fragile warmth of the fire pit shattered. Fen and Bryn snapped awake, eyes flaring yellow. Torvald dropped down from his watchpost and landed, without a sound, beside Rourke. "They've got our scent," he hissed. "Coming up the ridge." Rourke stood, and the tiredness fell off him all at once, and what was left was the cold, terrible thing that had united a dozen packs by force. He drew the broadsword. "Kick dirt over the coals," he said. Wren was already moving. She smothered the ember pit, and the world went black, total blinding dark, and she didn't need to see. She drew her silver blades and stepped up beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "How many?" she asked. Calm, deadly quiet. "Too many," Rourke said. And down in the dark, the chittering swelled, and under it came the frantic crunch of claws on ice, and the whole ravine seemed to lean in around them. The dark in the ravine wasn't the absence of light. It was a weight. The chittering bounced off the shale until it was everywhere and nowhere, and Wren's breathing slowed, and her heart came down to that flat level beat because this was the one place the whole world ever made sense to her. Not castles, not carriages. Here, in the half-second before the killing starts. "Form up, backs to the cliff." Rourke's voice cut clean through the panic. Fen and Bryn dropped low, and their bones began to crack and shift in the dark. A wet, wrong, terrible sound. Wren didn't look. She kept her eyes forward. "How do you want to play this valley girl?" Torvald growled on her right. An axe in each hand, the mockery gone from him completely. "They're rabid, no tactics," she said fast, her eyes eating the thin moonlight bleeding through the clouds. "They'll funnel through the narrowest part of the cut. It's a choke point." She was building the ground in her mind, laying it over the sounds. "I take the front. I break their charge. When they stumble, you finish them. And do not let them bite you. If that black spit gets in your blood, you become one of them." Torvald nodded once. The first rot hound broke the dark, a horror of matted fur and bare ribs and milk-white eyes, and it launched off a boulder straight for Rourke's throat. Wren pivoted. Her arm snapped forward. The silver knife took the beast dead center in the chest, and its momentum died as the metal burned through its nerves and it crashed into the dirt. And then Fen and Bryn were on it, fully shifted, now massive timber-gray shapes tearing into the vanguard, and the air filled with snapping bone and torn meat and feral roars. "Right wall!" Wren shouted. Torvald spun. A rothound was crawling down the shale, lining up to drop on Bryn's exposed back. He hurled an axe. It pinned the thing to the rock for half a second, and then the beast tore its own shoulder free and leapt anyway. Wren was already there. She drew the wire garrote taut between her gloved hands, and caught the hound mid-fall. The silver-laced wire bit deep, and its own weight carried it down onto the loop, and its head rolled to Torvald's boots. He stared at it, then at her. "Nice trick," he said. "Focus." She stepped back into the line, and then the main pack hit them all at once, a dozen of them. More. The sheer mass of diseased muscle drove the defenders back toward the cliff, and it stopped being a fight with any shape to it, and became a slaughter in the dark. Wren fought with the terrible economy Osric had beaten into her cut. The tendon pivot drive, the silver into the base of the skull. Pull-free duck, the jaws again. She was black with foul blood to the elbows. Beside her, Rourke cut through them like a storm given weight, and edges, cleaving hounds in half with sweeping arcs of the broadsword. But there were too many. There were always too many. A hound, 300 pounds of diseased muscle, slammed into Torvald and knocked the axes from his hands and threw him into the rock wall, and the breath went out of him in a rush, and the thing pinned him, jaws snapping inches from his face, black spit raining down. Wren turned to help. Two smaller hounds boxed her in, drove her back, and Rourke saw it. He roared a sound that started as a man's and ended as something that shook the stone, and he dropped his sword. And in the space of a heartbeat, the king shifted. No slow agony. An explosion of mass and gray fur, and Rourke the wolf was a nightmare that dwarfed even the infected pack, and he hit the hound, pinning Torvald, and closed his jaws on its spine, and broke it in half, and flung it away like nothing. But in that moment, that one exposed moment, the last hound struck. It came out of the shadows and sank its jagged, rotten teeth deep into Rourke's left shoulder, the same shoulder that had ached in the cold, the old wound torn open new. The king screamed. He ripped the thing off him and crushed its skull under a paw and collapsed into the snow, shifting back to a man as he fell. And the ravine went dead silent. The last of the infected pack lay dead in the churned red snow. Fen and Bryn stood panting, gore-soaked, unbitten. Torvald scrambled up, clutching his ribs. Wren didn't wait. She was already at Rourke's side. He was curled against the shale, gripping his shoulder, and black blood was welling from the wound, and the skin around it was going a sick dead gray. Torvald, fire, now. We can't. The smoke. There is nothing left out there to hunt us. and her calm broke finally all the way. She jabbed a finger at Rourke's shoulder, where black veins were already crawling up toward his throat. If we don't burn this out of him in 3 minutes, he dies. Or worse, build the fire. The fire roared up and threw wild shadows on the bloody cliff. Rourke was conscious, barely, his gray eyes hazed and dilating his chest, heaving every breath, a tearing rasp as the rot fever took him. Wren knelt over him and ripped the sleeve away from the wound. 4 deep punctures, oozing black sludge. The veins around them raised and pulsing dark. Listen to me. She grabbed his face in her blood-stained hands and forced his eyes to hers. Rourke, look at me. He found her, slowly. Cold, he rasped, his teeth chattering even with the fever burning off his skin. I know. The Arot's trying to freeze your blood. I have to cauterize it. She swallowed against dry throat. I have to use silver. Fen, back in his human skin standing guard, stepped forward. You put silver in his blood, you'll kill him. If I don't, the rot reaches his brain in 2 minutes. She didn't look up. She looked at Rourke. You told me you poured boiling sap into your own throat to live. I need you to be that man right now. Can you? Rourke looked at the scar on his own neck. He looked at the knife in her hand. He gave one short, tight nod. Torvald his legs, Fen his right arm, Bryn his head. They moved without a word. They pinned their king to the frozen ground. Wren thrust the silver skinner into the hottest heart of the ember pit and counted 10 agonizing seconds until the metal glowed a dull rose orange. She pulled it free. The heat coming off the blade made the freezing air shimmer, bite down. She shoved a thick leather strap between his teeth, and she did not close her eyes, because she couldn't afford to flinch. She pressed the glowing silver flat against the wound, and the sound of searing meat filled the canyon, and Rourke's back arched clear off the ground with a strength that nearly threw all 3 wolves. He screamed into the leather, a muffled, ragged roar that went straight through the rock and into Wren's chest and lodged there. The silver burned through the black rot. She held it 3 seconds, watched the sludge boil and turn to ash, watched the corrupted veins recede as the heat and the metal killed the thing living in him. Done. She pulled the blade away and threw it hissing into the snow. It's done. Rourke went limp, spat out the strap, gasped. The wound was an ugly charred crater, but the black was gone. The blood seeping now was bright, clean, red. Wren sat back on her heels, and her hands were shaking, which they hadn't done in 10 years. Not once. Not in the crypts, not in the ruins, not with a rogue's jaws an inch from her face. But they shook now over him, and she couldn't make them stop. She wet a scrap of linen from her canteen and pressed it to his forehead, wiping away the sweat and the dirt. Rourke opened his eyes, exhausted, broken, entirely, completely lucid. You didn't miss, he whispered. I never miss, she said, soft. Torvald dragged a hand down his face, staring at the charred wound, then at her. And every ounce of hostility that had been in him was gone, replaced with something heavier, something like awe. That rot, he said, staring out at the pile of dead hounds. It moved too fast. I've never seen hounds swarm like that. They were starving, but they walked past 3 villages in the foothills to come straight up this ridge, straight to our territory. Wren stopped wiping Rourke's forehead, and something cold settled in her gut. Colder than the snow, colder than the dark. She stood, walked to the largest dead hound, knelt in the muck and pried its jaws open and looked down its throat. Then she ran her fingers along the scruff of its neck and found it, a thick, unnatural knot of scar tissue. They didn't walk past the villages, she said. Dead flat. She drew a small knife and cut into the scar tissue and dug her fingers in and pulled out a small, heavy object. Wiped the blood off on her leg. Held it up to the firelight. An iron tracking tag. And stamped into the metal was a crest. A silver hawk perched on a broken sword. Her father's crest. "Merrick's hounds," she said, and her voice didn't sound like her own. "He breeds them for his fighting pits. He infects them with rot blood, starves them, drops them in a cage to tear each other apart for sport." She stared at the tag. "But these were let loose, driven up the mountain pass, right behind my carriage." Rourke pushed himself up against the rock, swaying, and Wren watched the whole cowardly, brilliant, monstrous shape of it come clear. Because Merrick had not just sent her to kill the Wolf King. He'd known she might fail, or that Rourke might kill her the moment he smelled the silver. So he'd used the carriage, the scent of valley blood, the fresh grain in the wagons as a lure. A trail of bait dragging a starving, rabid pack straight up to the Iron Crag. If Wren killed the king, good. If she didn't, the rot would tear through the pack and rot them from the inside, and the wolves would be finished anyway. Either way, Merrick broke the treaty, ended the threat to his trade roads, and never spent a single soldier doing it. "He didn't just sell me," Wren whispered, and her voice cracked the first time it had cracked since the valley. "He used me as bait." Rourke got to his feet. He swayed hard, caught himself on the rock, and stayed up. And he crossed to her. And he didn't say anything. He just reached out with his good hand and closed her fingers over the iron tag, wrapping his fever-hot grip around her cold one. "We leave at first light," he said. "We go home. We heal." He looked down at the tag in their joined hands. "And then, Valley Girl, you and I are going to have a long conversation about your father." The return to the Iron Crag took 2 days, and the mountain did everything it could to keep them from making it. The storm that had been threatening all week finally broke, dropping a foot of fresh powder over the pass, and Rourke's fever spiked twice on the climb, hard enough that they had to stop and dig in and wait it out under the pelts. But Wren's brutal field surgery held. The black stayed gone. And by the time the fortress walls loomed up out of the tree line, gray on gray, in the falling snow, the king was walking under his own power, though he leaned on Torvald to do it. The courtyard went silent as they came through the gate. The pack stopped their chopping and their mending and their hauling, and they looked. They saw the blood. They saw their alpha hurt. And they saw the Valley Girl walking beside him, not a prisoner in a white dress anymore, but a hunter, coated to the elbows in dried gore, her silver worn openly on her hips. Rourke stopped in the center of the yard. He looked at his people. And when he spoke, his voice came rough, but it carried, and no one who heard it doubted a word. "The deep woods are clear," he said. "The rot was driven up from the valley, deliberately, an attack by Duke Merrick. He let that land. But the threat is dead. All of it." He put his hand on Wren's shoulder. Not a claim. Not a man laying hold of a thing he owned. An acknowledgement. Wren of the Valley killed the vanguard. She tracked the pack through country you couldn't smell your way across. And she pulled the rot out of my blood with her own hands. He looked out at every face. She is not leverage. She is not a peace offering. She is pack. A murmur went through the yard, and then, the strangest thing Wren had ever seen. Several of the old wolves, gray-muzzled, scarred the ones who'd fought to build this place, bowed their heads to her, and tilted their chins up, baring their throats, just slightly. The deepest respect one wolf can give another. And something happened in Wren's chest that she had no name for, because she'd never felt it before. She had no word for it yet, but it warmed her more than any fire in that hall. They gave Rourke 2 weeks to heal before anyone spoke of war. 2 weeks in which the wound scarred over clean, and the fever left him for good, in which the snow deepened and the passes closed, in which Wren learned the rhythm of a place that was slowly without anyone deciding it becoming home. She fixed the bear traps so they'd hold. She taught Fen and Bryn to read a trail with their eyes so the rot could never blind them again. And in the evenings, she sat by the great hearth, and Rourke sat beside her, and they didn't always talk, and the not talking was its own kind of comfort. She caught Torvald watching her one night, not with the brass-eyed hostility of the first day, with something quieter. "My family died in a valley raid," he said. He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at the fire. 9 years ago, my wife, my daughter. Merrick's men burned the border village they'd fled to, called it a wolf reprisal so they could take the land clean after. His jaw worked. So when they sent me a valley girl in a white dress, I wanted to hate you. It was easier than the truth. "Which is," Wren asked, "which is that you're the first person from down there who ever bled for us instead of over us." He got up before she could answer, but he stopped at the edge of the firelight. "For what it's worth," he said, "I was wrong about you." And he was gone into the dark. On the 15th day, they stood over the scarred table in the map room, the fire high in the grate, and they planned the end of Duke Merrick. "He's waiting for news," Wren said, leaning over the valley traced in ink and iron pins. "He'll expect silence. He'll assume the hounds finished the keep, or that I killed you and ran. Come spring, he'll send his garrison up the pass to claim the iron mines and call the whole thing a tragedy. Then we don't wait for spring." Rourke's gray eyes were hard and bright. "We strike in deep winter. Wolves don't freeze. Valley soldiers do. You want to attack the valley. I want to attack Merrick." He corrected her sharp. "Not his farmers, not his peasants. The man who sent infected hounds to slaughter my children." He paused, and his voice gentled, which somehow made it heavier. "But he's your father, Wren. I won't march you against your own blood. If you tell me to do this alone, I'll do it alone." Wren looked at the map for a long time. She thought about the cold lodge, the chains, the carriage ride into the snow, and the iron tag she'd pulled from the throat of a diseased animal, her father's crest stamped into the metal that had nearly killed the only man who'd ever given her a blanket instead of an order. She took the tag out of her pocket, and she set it down on the map, directly over her father's castle. "My blood left me in the woods to die," she said. "Quiet." She met his eyes. "You gave me a place by your fire." She planted her hands flat on the table, and her mind shifted. Gears dropped the ache, locked into the cold, clean machine that was the only inheritance her father had ever meant to leave her. "His garrison's at the river fort," she said fast now. "In deep winter the river freezes, but the mud turns to concrete. His heavy cavalry can't move. The granaries are in the eastern quadrant. We hit the stores first, and the panic does half our work. And there's a drainage grate under the old crypts. The iron bars haven't been changed in 80 years. A wolf can't fit through. A person can. I get in. I open the postern gate from the inside, and I let the pack into the lower bailey before the alarm ever sounds." Rourke listened, and he didn't see a hunter anymore. He saw a general. When she finished, the little room went quiet, but for the fire. He came around the table and stopped in front of her. He was so much larger than she was, but she didn't feel small, and she didn't reach for her knives, and she noticed she didn't, and the noticing startled her. "You don't have to do this," he said low. "You've earned your place. You could stay in the keep. You don't have to go back into the dark." Ren reached up, traced the edge of the scar on his neck with one fingertip barely touching. "I've always lived in the dark, Rourke," she said. "The difference now is I know exactly what I'm hunting." He caught her hand. Warm, solid, gentle beyond any right a man who tore beasts in half had to be gentle. He didn't pull her close. He didn't kiss her, because they weren't a fairy tale, the two of them. They were two broken weapons who had finally, after a lifetime, found the right hands to be held in. He pressed his forehead to hers. A wolf's gesture, the oldest one there is. Absolute trust. "Then we hunt together," the Wolf King swore. They came down out of the mountains in the dead of the coldest night of the year. 40 wolves moving through the frozen forest like gray water, and one small human running silent at the front. And the valley lay below them, sleeping under snow, its river, a road of black ice, its castle, a hunched shape of towers and torchlight, the place Ren had been born and hidden and thrown away. She'd forgotten how the wind sounded down here, softer than the mountain. It made her chest ache in a way she didn't have time for. The drainage grate was exactly where 13 years of memory said it would be. Half buried in ice forgotten, its ancient bars weeping rust. Ren went to work with a pry bar, while the pack waited in the tree line, breath smoking, still as stone. And she slipped down into the dark under her father's house. The crypts smelled of cold stone and older dust, and she moved through them, the way she moved through everything, without sound, without hesitation. A ghost in the place that had made her a ghost. Up a servant's stair, across a courtyard she'd crossed 100 times as a child, carrying water, keeping her eyes down. To the postern gate. She lifted the bar, and she let the wolves in. It happened almost without noise. That was the terrible mercy of it. 40 wolves pouring through a gate into a sleeping fort, and by the time the first alarm bell rang, it was already too late. The granary was open. The garrison was scrambling half-dressed into a courtyard full of teeth, and the panic Ren had promised did exactly what she'd promised it would. But she wasn't watching the fight, because she was running through the halls of her childhood toward the one room she knew her father would carry. And something was wrong. Something she couldn't name yet, because the guards on the family wing were doubled, because there was a smell of blood already up here, away from the fighting. And because when she reached the old keeper's quarters, Osric's room kept for him. Whenever he came down from the lodge, the door was open, and Osric was inside, on the floor, gone. Ren dropped to her knees beside the old man who had raised her like a hound and loved her like a daughter, without ever once knowing how to say it. And she saw the wound, and she knew it was recent, and she knew with a cold that went deeper than any mountain night that it had been done today, because someone had wanted to silence him. Today, before she could reach him. There was a paper crushed in his fist. She had to bend his fingers back to take it. She made herself do it. And in his hand, in his own shaking, half-blind scrawl, Osric had written the thing he'd carried for 13 years and never found the courage to say to her face, "Your mother did not die of fever." The letters swam. Ren blinked and made them hold still. She meant to run. She had you packed and ready. She was taking you away from him to the coast that winter. And he could not have it known that a scullery maid had tried to steal a bastard out from under a duke. So he had her cup poisoned. I watched them do it, and I said nothing, because I was a coward, and he owned me. I raised you hard, so you would be too strong for him to ever do to you what he did to her. Forgive me. I could not save her. I only ever tried to save you." Wren knelt on the cold stone with her mother's murder in one hand, and her mother's murderer 3 doors down the hall. And for one moment, one long, roaring, silent moment, the machine her father had built inside her woke all the way up and reached for the wheel, because he had poisoned a woman for the crime of trying to keep her child. Because Wren had spent 13 years believing in a fever that never was. Because he had killed the one old man who'd loved her today to keep this very paper out of her hands. Because everything all the way down was a lie he had told to protect his gold and his name. She rose, and she walked toward the throne room with silver in both hands. Duke Merrick was not sleeping. I was standing at the great window of his hall, watching his fort fall in a fur-lined robe with wine in his hand, and he was not alone. Because kneeling on the floor beside him, gagged wrists bound a blade at her throat, held by a nervous house guard, was a woman Wren knew, Eloan, her half-sister, the only one of Merrick's true-born daughters who had ever as a girl snuck bread down to the lodge and sat with the bastard in the cold and treated her like a person instead of a shame. The only one Wren had ever grieved leaving. He'd brought her here as a shield, because of course he had. "There she is," Merrick said, calm, almost warm, as if she were a hound that had come home. "My clever little ghost. I did wonder which way it would go." Wren stopped 10 paces off. "Let her go. Or you'll do what—" He smiled. "Throw a knife, you might hit the girl. You were always so precise. But your hands are shaking, Wren." He'd seen it. Of course he'd seen it. They never used to shake. Have the wolves made you soft? Or is it grief I saw you found, old Osric? A pity. He talked too much at the end. You poisoned my mother. I removed a thief. No pause. No flicker. She tried to steal my property. You. I'll not apologize for protecting what's mine." He gestured wine sloshing at the burning yard below. "As I protected the valley. From them. From the beasts you've now let into my house. Do you understand what you've done, girl? You've sided with the animals against your own blood." And here was the thing. Here was the moment her whole life had been forged for. Behind Wren, silent as death, Rourke came into the hall. She felt him more than heard him, felt the wolves fill the doorway. And she knew without looking that Rourke would end it if she asked, that he would cross the room and take her father's throat in his jaws, and she would never have to carry the weight of it herself. He would take the last bite for her, because that was what he was. Her shield. All she had to do was step aside. And oh, she wanted to. Except something Osric had written stopped her hand. "I raised you hard, so you would be too strong for him to ever do to you what he did to her." Too strong. And she understood finally what her father had spent 19 years making her into. A knife. A thing that solved his problems in the dark with silver and left no name behind. And if she crossed this room now in her grief with her mother's death screaming in her blood and opened his throat, she would be exactly the knife he'd forged. She would prove he'd been right about her all along. The valley would whisper that the mad bastard butchered her own father, and he would win. Even dead, he would win. because he would have made her, at the very last, into him. No. Wren lowered the knives. She saw the flicker of confusion cross Rourke's face. She saw Merrick's smile widen, mistaking it for weakness, mistaking it, as he had always mistaken it, for the softness of a girl. And then she turned, not to her father, to the guard holding the blade at Eloin's throat. A young man, terrified. A boy really doing a job in a burning house. "Look at him," Wren said to the guard. "Quiet, steady. Look at the man you're bleeding for." She pointed to the window to the ruin below. He infected animals with a plague and drove them past sleeping villages. Your villages to break a treaty he didn't want to pay for. He poisoned a serving woman for loving her child. He killed a blind old man this morning to bury the truth. And when the wolves came for him tonight, he put his own daughter in front of him as a shield. She let it sit. That's the man. Is he worth your soul? The whole hall held its breath. And the boy, the terrified boy, took the blade away from Eloin's throat. He stepped back. And he was not the only one, because the doors of the hall had filled not just with wolves now, but with people, servants. Guards, the lesser lords of the valley, who'd come running at the alarm and found themselves listening. And they had heard all of it. And Wren had made certain they would. Because that was the plan. Plan she hadn't said aloud to anyone. Not to kill him, to unmake him. "You're lying," Merrick said. But his voice had changed. The warmth was gone out of it. He looked around at the faces of his own people, and for the first time in his life, the Duke of the Valley saw something in those faces that he could not command. "She's a bastard and a killer. She'd say anything." "The hounds carried your tag," Wren said. She held up the iron crest, the silver hawk on the broken sword, for the whole hall to see. "Your crest, bred in your pits. I cut it out of a rothound's throat with my own knife." She looked at the lords. "Send men to the pits below the river fort. You'll find the cages. You'll find the sick ones he hasn't loosed yet. And then you'll know which of us has been lying to you." And she watched it happen. She watched a lifetime of fear curdle into something else on the faces of her father's people. She watched the lords she'd never been allowed to speak to exchange glances. She watched two of them carefully, deliberately step back from the man they'd served and let the space around Merrick grow, the way water pulls back from something before a wave. He was still standing in his fine fur robe, but he was standing alone. They did not execute Duke Merrick. Wren wouldn't allow it. And by the end of that long night, Wren's word carried weight in a hall that had never once let her speak. The lords convened, and the evidence was found exactly where she'd said it would be: the cages, the sick hounds, the ledgers in his own hand, recording the whole cowardly design. And they stripped him of his title, his lands, his name. I was given a room. One room. In a corner of the keep, he had ruled with a fire he was allowed to keep lit, and a guard on the door, not to keep him in, but to keep the valley's grief from getting at him. He would live out his years there, watching the world he'd owned move on without him, watching his ghost of a daughter become the one thing he'd never let her be. Seen. Which was, Wren thought, a worse sentence than any blade, because a blade ends, and this would not. Torvald did not come home from the valley. When the garrison finally found its nerve and rallied at the river fort, someone had to hold the bridge while the pack got the freed prisoners and the children out. Someone had to stand in the choke point with an axe in each hand and buy the seconds. And Torvald, who had wanted so badly to hate her, who had lost his wife and his daughter, to men from this very valley, stood on that bridge and did not step back. They found him after, in the snow, surrounded, and Wren knelt beside him the way she'd knelt beside so many dead things. Except this one had called her hunter. This one had said, "I was wrong about you." This one had died, buying life for the children of the people who'd killed his own. He'd broken the loop, at the very end. He'd chosen it. They carried him up the mountain and buried him at the tree line facing the valley, so he could watch the border he'd died protecting. Wren wept, which surprised her, because she'd told herself once that weapons don't cry when they're left in the cold. Except she wasn't a weapon anymore. She hadn't been, she realized, since the night a tired king threw a blanket on the floor and gave a stranger the bed. Spring came late and slow to the mountains that year, but it came. The snow pulled back off the black stones of the iron crag. The children of the lower Bailey fed all winter, every one of them on grain that used to rot in a duke's cellars, ran shrieking through mud that no longer had blood in it. Elowen stayed. She had nowhere she'd rather be, she said, than near the sister she'd only ever been allowed to love in secret. And she took to the mountain, the way some people take to the truth, like they'd been waiting for it their whole lives. Wren carried her mother's bones up out of the valley in the thaw. She buried them on a high slope, where the wind came clean off the peaks, and the first flowers of the year pushed up through the last of the snow. She'd never been given a chance to grieve at 6 years old over a fever that was really a poison. So she took the chance now. She sat with her mother a long time, and she told her out loud to the wind that the running had been worth it, that the coast had been a good dream, that her daughter had gotten there in the end, just by a longer road and through a stranger door than either of them could have imagined. Rourke found her there as the light was going. He didn't speak. He just sat down beside her on the cold ground, and after a while she leaned into him, and after a longer while his arm came around her, warm as a fire, steady as stone. "I keep waiting for it to feel like a trap," she said finally. "Quiet. The wanting to stay. I keep waiting to be a fool for it." "And?" Rourke asked. Wren looked out over the valley. Gold in the last of the sun, and the mountains gone violet behind them, and the little lights of the keep coming on below, where the children were being called in to supper. "And it doesn't," she said. He pressed his forehead to hers. The oldest gesture, absolute trust. And the girl. They'd dressed in white wool and sent up the mountain to die. The bastard. The shadow. The ghost, the knife her father had forged in the dark and thrown away, closed her eyes and let the warmth of another living soul seep into her bones, and understood at last the name of the thing she'd been feeling in her chest since the day the old wolves bared their throats to her. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even peace. It was the simplest thing in the world, and the one thing she'd been denied her whole life. She was home. She had never been a weapon. She had only ever been a person waiting the length of a hard, cold life for someone to look at her and see one. And now someone had. Which in the end is the only thing any of us are really waiting for.